First of all, thanks very much for having me, and thanks very much to my commentators. And just as you said, in 2013, Tony and I had a paper in philosophy of science pushing back on mechanistic explanation in some ways. And there's been many references, discussions about the paper in the intervening years. So I thought it was time to sort of update the paper and reply, and that's what I'm doing herein. So here are the three parts of the talk. I'll try to give the argument and the targets. It turns out trying to determine who the targets are is a little slipperier than maybe it ought to be, so I'll spend some time on that. I'll talk about a case study, and then I'll talk about possible objections. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the case study. Normally, I would rather spend most of the time going through a particular case. But here, there's no way for me to sort of make the grander argument and spend as much time as I'd like. So that's what I'll start doing. So here's the master argument that I want to defend, and I think that Tony and I were trying to defend in the paper. Premise one, mechanistic explanation is defined essentially in terms of localization and decomposition. Premise two, there are features of some complex biological and cognitive systems that fail in principle to be explained in terms of localization and decomposition. Conclusion, mechanistic explanation as portrayed by the new mechanists sometimes fails in the case of biological and cognitive systems, sometimes fails in principle. So now we have to have a discussion about defining localization and decomposition, because it turns out there's not so much agreement about that these days, and it's important to do that to sort of figure out who the target of the argument is. So neo-mechanists have over the years gotten much more liberal in their definition of these terms, or even in their advocacy of these terms. So, for example, they often like to stress that mechanisms need not be localizable, a mechanistic explanation need not be reductionist, they can be multi-scale, etc. So you might wonder, well, who's really left, to aim the sort of argument at. And so that's what I want to do, is say who I think the target is. So, and I think there are two components to this. There's a sort of epistemological version of localization and decomposition. That's one target. And then I think there is a kind of ontological version as well. Ultimately, I'm not sure they're separable. But here's an example, some recent examples of the sort of ontological version that I want to target. So Povich and Kramer from 2018, the behavior of the whole contains the behavior of the parts, and the behaviors of the parts collectively and exhaustively constitute the behavior of the whole. So that's how they want to think about mechanisms. Glennon and Ilari, all things are physical, and their causal capacities must depend upon their basic physical constituents. And again, mechanisms as wholes do what they do because of the activities of the parts. So that seems pretty straightforwardly those are ontological claims, and they're very clear about how they're thinking about mechanisms. So one question I have is, how is this new liberalism of the neo-mechanists consistent with the previous claims? How can it be true that decomposition, as previously defined by those folks, as essential to mechanistic explanation, can fail, and yet such failure doesn't count as a counterexample? I'll return to this question at the end. And the question in general is, well, what does count as an interesting counterexample to mechanistic explanation now? One answer somebody might give is, oh, well, you're just, we have to be careful not to equivocate between epistemic and ontic claims. So some people want to say, oh, look, I'm just doing the epistemology of science. I'm just making heuristic claims about localization and decomposition, which I think is perfectly fine. But I think the kinds of cases that I want to talk about are counterexamples even to those epistemic claims. but my target is not only them, it's also people who want to make ontological claims of the sort that I just read to you. I also want to say that I'm skeptical that these things can be totally divorced from one another. That is, surely there is an ontic difference between a system a mechanist agrees is explanatorily decompositional and one that isn't. Otherwise, what is the explanation tracking about the physical nature of these systems? So we have some really good guidance, at least in the past. We've had some really good guidance from the arch mechanists about when mechanistic explanation fails. So Bechtel and Richardson. So let's just remind ourselves about what they said. When there are component parts and operations, but their individual behaviors systematically and continuously affect one another in a nonlinear fashion. In this case, mechanisms are not sequential, but have a cyclic organization rife with oscillations, feedback loops, or recurrent connections between components. In these instances, there's a high degree of interactivity among the components, and the system is non-decomposable, and therefore localization will fail. So the key idea here is where the line is between those systems that are amenable to mechanistic explanation and those that aren't is whether they are, or to what degree they are, decomposable or non-decomposable. And I want to just say right here that I want to be clear that nonlinearity, I'm happy to grant nonlinearity is certainly neither necessary nor sufficient for this, but there are certain kinds of nonlinearity as they suggest in this passage. And of course, there are other ways that have nothing to do with nonlinearity. There are linear examples as well where decomposability fails. Here's some other remarks that they make. When almost all, quote, the operations of component parts in the system will depend on the actual behavior and the capacities of its other components, unquote. So again, the idea is if the activities and behaviors is highly causally or in some other important way dependent on one another, then they're non-decomposable. Again, if the nonlinearity affecting component operations also affects the behavior of the system as a whole, such that the component property states are dependent on the total state-independent characterization of the system, i.e., one sufficient to determine the state and the dynamics of the system as a whole, then the behavior of the system can be called emergent. I think for them, emergent means essentially not decomposable to some strong degree. The behavior of the component, another one finally, the behavior of the component parts considered within the system as a whole are not predictable in principle from the behavior in isolation. And again, this would be because of that sort of non-decomposable aspect. So what does all this mean? Let's sum it up. Bechtel and Richardson are saying mechanistic explanation fails. That is, a process fails to be a mechanism. In other words, I think that has ontological implications. Precisely when the kind of part-whole decomposition relation touted by Povich and Kramer and Glennon fails to obtain. So I'm trying to be very clear about who the targets are and exactly what I hope to give a counterexample, what I think there are counterexamples in complex biological systems against. And this isn't very surprising because this kind of decomposition relation is and has always been to one degree or another the very heart of mechanistic explanation. Somehow the story has to be that the parts explain the whole. Must the story be as simplistic as Descartes? No. Must it be as simplistic as some sort of one-to-one mapping between a cognitive function and a brain area? No. But my concern is how much of this idea about mechanistic explanation can one jettison and still reasonably call it a mechanistic process or a mechanistic explanation? And that's what Tony and I were worried about in the original argument. So the target, again, my claim then is that there are many cases of complex biological systems wherein this sort of decomposition really fails in principle. So let's look at some case studies where it does fail. And before I get to the case studies, just let me say something about objections, which I'll deal with afterwards. Here is what I want to say is the case. If after examining the case studies, you still want to claim such systems are mechanistic, then per the master argument that I began with, here are your choices. Deny premise one and argue that mechanisms or mechanistic explanation needn't involve localization or decomposition at all. There are certainly examples of that in the literature. Or deny premise two and argue that I've gotten my facts wrong about the cases. And there are some other strategies which I'll talk about in more detail in the end. For example, you might try to invoke some brand of pluralism that deflates the tension or somehow makes both sides right. I'll talk about that and some other objections at the end of the talk. So I think it's really important. There's so many different issues. I tried to disentangle a lot of them in the paper that the commentators read. Throughout the years, I think Tony and I, in our original paper, we had a bunch of these different issues in mechanistic explanation. I think that we didn't properly disentangle them. So I want to do that now. My argument here is primarily about empirical counterexamples to localization and decomposition. So in other words, I'm not primarily worried about issues about abstraction. That's a big concern in the literature. For example, are graph theoretic network explanations just abstractions, what have you. I'm not primarily worried about realism. So in the literature, especially in the literature from pluralism, you can see people worrying about, is there just one mind-independent way to carve up the world into, hierarchies in terms of scales or in terms of the spatiotemporal boundaries and mechanisms or what have you. I'm not primarily worried about that. I'm not primarily worried about pluralism, and I'm not primarily worried about the dynamical nomological versus mechanistic explanation. In other words, I'm not primarily worried to defend myself against predictivism. I'm not primarily worried to claim that dynamical explanations are always explanatory, even when they don't advert to any particular mechanism. I think these are all important issues, and they're all certainly related to what I want to talk about. But for me, these things become important issues because there are real cases of the failure of localization and decomposition. And I think this is important to emphasize because I think in the paper that Tony and I wrote and some of the other papers that people were writing, obviously a lot of people around that time were talking about graph theory and neuroscience and networks. So it wasn't just us. And I think a lot of these issues got bound up with each other. So for example, here's the sort of thing that Tony and I would say. Systems biology and systems neuroscience contain robust dynamical and mathematical explanations of some phenomena in which the essential explanatory work is in principle not being done by localization and composition. More positively, the explanatory work in these models is being done by their graphical network properties and the dynamics therein. So you see the language is vague. Somebody might say, well, yes, I agree that if we just focus on the explanatory heuristic, it's not about, parts. It's not about local matters of fact. It's not about structure. But then they would say, so what? I mean, that could all be true, but these could just be schemas for structures or just abstractions of structures or what have you. And then, so that is a whole subject in itself. And I want to say, no, it's not just about that. There really are counterexamples to localization and decomposition. So I think we did in the paper a fairly good job at focusing on the issue of localization and decomposition. So I want to quote something from the paper that I hope is evidence of what I just said. Here's what we said. The key questions here are A, whether brains have the topological architectures they do in virtue of their structural mechanisms or vice versa. And B, in virtue of what do graph theoretic models explain? As Bechtel himself admits, in such non-decomposable complex systems, the global topological features act as order parameters or collective variables. They greatly constrain the behavior of the structural elements. As Sporns puts it, a reentrant system operates less as a hierarchy and more as a heterarchy, where super and subordinate levels are indistinct. Most interactions are circular and control is decentralized. We meant this claim to be an ontological claim as reflected by these sorts of explanations, these sorts of network explanations. We take Sporns to be making an ontological claim about the physical nature of these systems as well. We went on to say the dynamical interactions here are recurrent, recursive, and reentrant. So there's no sense in which the arrow of explanation or determination is in principle exclusively from the lower level structural to the higher level graphical dynamical. Simply put, such global organizational principles or features of complex systems are not explicable in principle via localization and decomposition. So that is, and was, and will be in this paper, the central claim. And the reason, so the abstraction and all those other sort of things are piggybacking on this fact about, physical fact about the systems. In other words, in network models, the behaviors and relations of the structural elements is explained by the fact that they are instantiating and maintaining a certain kind of network, which is performing certain kinds of functions. And again, I don't mean this to be just some sort of explanatory heuristic about design explanations versus mechanistic explanations. I'm saying I think our best biology is telling us this is the way these systems really are physically. So now I have a number of slides that sort of go over what Tony and I said about graph theoretic explanations in neuroscience. And I'm not really going to go through them because all that stuff is in the original paper. And I want to get to talk about some new cases that I think from complex biological systems, from epigenomics, et cetera, which I think require not having to say anything about mathematical graphical representation. But let me just sort of rehearse what we said about graphical explanations briefly. So these dynamical explanations, their coordination is highly distributed and non-local. They often involve population coding, cooperative or collective effects. Time and timing is essential in a number of ways. These processes exhibit both robustness and plasticity. I'll come back to that. They're highly context and task sensitive. And the word context here is going to be really important for me. Because for me, the bottom line is contextuality is a fundamental feature of these sorts of systems. It's not merely contextuality, multi-scale contextuality, and it's not merely just a background condition for why a mechanism works. So the key explanatory features of these sorts of models involve various time-varying properties, the exact timing of the spike, the ordering or sequencing of processing events, etc. So again, I'm not going to go into the stuff in great detail. I'm going to assume we all know, you've read the 2013 paper, you know how these graph theoretic stories work. What matters is that the topology, the pattern of connections, that's what's doing the explaining. Different geometries, that is to say, arrangements of nodes and edges, whatever you think they may represent structurally, can instantiate the same topology. So the study of this integrative brain function and connectivity is primarily based on topological features, network architectures that are insensitive to and multiply realizable with respect to lower level neurochemical and wiring details. And indeed, there's plenty of reason to believe that these network architectures are maintained even when at lower spatial and temporal timescales, the neurochemical, structural, and wiring details are changing rapidly. So those are the important things that I want to focus on about these sorts of explanations. Okay. Small world networks. I'm not going to, we all know what small world networks are. I'm not going to go into it. The claim, of course, here is that brains instantiate small world networks. We get the idea. So, what does this mean for explanation? Mapping between structural and topological features is at least many one. Very different neurochemical mechanisms and wiring diagrams can instantiate the same networks and thus perform the same cognitive functions. Indeed, it is often the topological features of various types of small world networks that explain essential organizational features of brains as opposed to the other way around. And again, I mean that not just as an explanatory heuristic, but as a claim about the nature of the systems. Structural and topological processes occur at radically different and hard, if not impossible, to relate timescales. The behavior and distribution of various nodes, such as local networks, are determined by their non-local or global connections. As Sporns puts it, heterogeneous, multi-scale patterns of structural connectivity shape the functional interactions of neural units, the spreading of activation, and the appearance of synchrony and coherence. So the explanation is not bottom-up, it's global, arguably adynamical in many cases, because it's about global constraints or order parameters, and it's at the very least top-down. Okay, skip this. But so that's the sort of stuff that Tony and I went into great detail about in the original paper. So one pushback that we've gotten about our claims is, yeah, but is all that just an artifact, an abstraction based on mathematical models? Why should we think that graph theoretic explanations or computer simulations thereof actually get anything real? Maybe they're just abstractions of the structural things that really matter. So here's what I want to do now. I want to say, okay, well, let's set aside neuroscience-oriented graph theory, and let's look at some other cases. Cases that I would argue are even textbook cases. Now, as I said at the beginning of the talk, I really don't have time to sort of try to make this master argument and reply to people, and also go into these other cases at length with the appropriate diagrams and so on. So I'm just going to rely on scientific authority and quote what some scientists, often in mainstream textbooks, say about these kinds of cases. If you think that they've gotten the facts wrong or that my interpretation is wrong, I'm sure you will let me know. So it seems to me the obvious case to talk about, because we're all familiar with it at this point, is the epigenomics. So again, I say this is, I think, textbook biology. Here's the sort of thing they say. As we are all now aware, the relationship between genes and proteins is many, and we must now think in terms of gene networks, RNA networks, protein networks, and the complex nonlinear interactions between them. Further, these relationships are also affected by several contextual features, including cellular environment, the wider organismic environment, and various features of the external environment in which the organism is situated. These interactions are obviously multi-scale, multi-level, inextricably interrelated, and interdependent. I want to say I think this is standard textbook biology at this point, and it certainly requires no representation in terms of some sort of graph theoretical formalism. Though people do that, and you certainly can do that, there's plenty of evidence for these claims beyond just some mathematical representation. Again, the genes cannot do what they do without the proteins, and the proteins are not free agents either. They respond to influences from across the rest of the organism and ultimately from the environment too. Genes are controlled by proteins. Those proteins are coded for by other genes. The other genes can in turn be switched on and off by other proteins coded for by yet other genes. Another quotation, gene actions are as much effect as cause during protein synthesis, and genomic activity is as much effect as cause during cellular differentiation, both normal and pathological. Again, all this sort of contextuality, right? That's the word I'm going to use for it, contextuality, multi-scale contextuality. In other places, I've called it contextual emergence, and I'll say a little bit more about that at the end. But this is true not just for proteins and what genes do and so on. It's true for every part of the developmental system. So, for example, it should be clear that all this contextuality goes for protein folding and protein function. Amino acid sequences alone determine neither three-dimensional structure or function. Other factors include many features of the cellular environment and cellular activities, such as various properties of water, lipids, and the interactions of many other molecules that are not coded for by genes. Nothing in the genome determines the topology of proteins. The biological information of proteins does not derive only from structural information, but also from the complex functional networks that connect specific binding sites at the molecular level to the cell's activity and to the more global organismic level of organization and functioning. Now, one could certainly imagine, and people do, constructing network-type abstract mathematical representations of these sort of relationships. But as many biologists, most, I would say at this point, would be happy to grant, those sorts of graphical representations are useful because they represent what we already know to be, for many other reasons, including bent science and so on, that this is the physical nature of these systems. So, and in relation to this sort of contextuality, we have these sort of more global properties of complex biological systems that we can talk about that I think are especially useful here. And again, we're all familiar with these terms, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it other than to define them. Plasticity, robustness, and autonomy. Perhaps this is best illustrated, and there are many versions of each of these, obviously, but perhaps this is best illustrated by the relationship between these three things. There are many different forms of these, such as developmental, phenotypic, neural, behavioral, immunological, etc. And even within those categories, obviously there are many different types of neuroplasticity and robustness and so on. So let's just look at a couple of examples. Phenotypic plasticity and robustness. This is the phenomenon in which genetically identical individuals will develop different phenotypic traits in different environmental conditions. Because of phenotypic plasticity, a single genotype or genome can produce many different phenotypes depending on environmental and developmental contingencies. Phenotypic plasticity is just one example of epigenomic processes in which various mechanisms create phenotypic variation without altering base pair nucleotide gene sequences, altering expression of genes but not the gene sequence. In contrast, there are cases in which genetic or environmental changes have no phenotypic effect. This persistence of a particular organism's traits across the environment or genetic changes is called robustness. Robustness is illustrated by various knockout experiments in synthetic biology, whereby a particular gene or group of genes or gene networks known to be involved in the development of some protein or phenotypic trait is disabled without disturbing the presence or production of the developmental end product in question. Again, all textbook biology. As Bateson and Gluckman note, robustness and plasticity are two sides of the same coin. They are interdependent. Indeed, plasticity is often regulated by robust mechanisms, and robustness is often generated by plastic mechanisms in an interplay of evolutionary and developmental processes. The ever-growing varieties of robustness and plasticity are co-creating and co-maintaining, allowing a complex biological system to have autonomy. Development involves both internal regulation and reciprocity with the environment. Careful analysis of what happens during development suggests that it is no longer helpful to retain a hard and fast distinction between robustness and plasticity. What's the point? Plasticity, robustness, and autonomy are well-known textbook, non-derived merely from abstracta, universal features of complex biological systems. These global and systemic features are well known from a lot of different fields in biology. They've been well known for a long time. They're well confirmed without appeal to any abstract mathematical models. It's also obvious that these features of complex biological systems are not explained by localization and decomposition. They can't be by definition. They are global systemic features. So there's no way that these complex biological features could be nothing but the sum of a collection of local matters of structural activity. Indeed, the reverse is true. That the reason, in many cases, that the parts and their activities, the structural processes, are doing what they do is because they are constrained by these global features. So, of course, what I want to say here is we don't have to get into the weeds about abstracta and mathematical representation. And we don't even have to focus strictly on concerns about cognitive function and network neuroscience. Because all of these things that we're talking about are true about complex biological systems in general. And obviously, all these things we're talking about occur in the brain as well. So it's not as if these are even a separate set of cases. This is all part of what brains do and how they do what they do. And this is stuff that biologists already know. So, but of course, the point I want to make here is this to me looks like a counterexample to localization and decomposition as I defined it earlier. So now let's look at some objections that I've seen in the literature and I've heard from people as I pass this paper around. First, okay, well, it's true that loc and decomposition fail in these cases, and it's true that this isn't a mere artifact of some formalism or model, but this is still compatible with such systems being mechanistic. I've seen a number of people make this claim. So I'll just give you one example. Levy and Bechtel say the following. We don't see much benefit in the project of defining mechanism. And further, any explanation that appeals to underlying parts in organization is mechanistic. I want to say, if that's now what we mean by a mechanistic system and what we mean by mechanistic explanation, then other than some very obvious and trivial counterexamples like vital forces or souls or connectionist networks that appear to have no particular distinguished parts, it seems like this is just, it's too weak. It's too trivial. They go on to, they clearly understand why people are going to have this concern, because they go on to say that they are not emptying the notion of mechanism of content because, quote, the contrast between mechanistic explanation and DN explanation or other formalist views of explanation is retained. And again, I'm happy to grant that. I'm happy to grant that even with all the non-decomposableness that I was just trying to illustrate, that those explanations in biology are not of the DN variety. But again, who isn't going to grant this? And this doesn't seem like a very interesting thing to point out. Surely there must be more to why we're so interested in mechanisms than that. So if you look at this paper and some of Bechtel's recent work, he says many of the same things that I do, not just Bechtel, but some other mechanists as well, not all. And so I'm puzzled. What now separates, my first question here, A, what now separates the mechanist from the dreaded holist, or in my lingo, I'll come back to this in a bit, the contextual emergentist? As noted earlier, Bechtel and Richardson were very clear where the line is, or was. If the behavior of most of the parts is a function of the behavior of most of the other parts in some complex way at various scales, if decomposition fails in this way, for example, certain kinds of nonlinearity, or it fails because the behavior of the parts are being determined or constrained by global constraints of the whole of the sort that I was talking about, robustness, plasticity, autonomy, then systems aren't mechanistic. So at least they gave us a red line in the past. But if they grant that these complex biological systems are not decomposable, that they have all the features that I outlined, then it seems to me that now they've even given up this condition of some things being mechanistic or a mechanistic explanation. So B, if now Bechtel and others have now erased this line, if a system can still be mechanistic, even if strongly non-decomposable, then short of vital forces, the non-existence of part, purely dynamical laws, and other trivial cases, then what would count as an interesting counterexample to the claims of the neo-mechanist in biology or cognitive science? For example, just to be provocative, is radically embodied cognition and enactivism even a counterexample now? Can those particular camps claim to be mechanists as well? Because it seems to me if they can, then we really have very little left of interest in this discussion, other than just pointing out cool cases from science, which I'm perfectly happy to do. So there'd better be an interesting answer, or otherwise this is just a subject for people who want to do the anthropology or the sociology of neuroscience. But even then, what implications we make about the activities of scientists is going to depend a lot on whether, for example, we decided to follow Gazzaniga around or Olaf Sporns. Explanation is obviously very pluralistic and heterogeneous in neuroscience. So C, do people like Bechtel and myself have any empirical disagreements about the nature of such complex biological systems or how certain types of explanation work? Or are we just left with a disagreement over what to label them? You say mechanism, I say contextual emergence, but we're not really disagreeing about anything. Again, that would make this not a very interesting conversation. We seem to all agree that such explanations don't involve vital forces. They are not of the DN variety. And there are parts that do stuff. So what are we debating? What's left? Here's my conclusion. Here's what I hope is at stake in this discussion. If it's not what's at stake, then I'm not sure why we need to keep having this discussion. Here we go. I believe biology is revealing a world that looks more and more like a series of multi-scale, overlapping, inextricably connected and interdependent heterogeneous contexts and constraints, rather than a world of nearly decomposable nomological machines, modules, or network motifs. I call this contextual emergence. I believe that contextual emergence itself will be the headline, that that's what we're really learning from biology, and not merely the mechanistic qualifier, or merely some background or initial conditions. So neo-mechanists are fond of saying, well, of course mechanisms are multi-scale, and of course we have to look up, down, and sideways. But they're also often very clear that they just mean that to be a sort of background condition that explains why the mechanism can do what it can do. Otherwise, where's the localization and the decomposition? So if the neo-mechanists like Bechtel now wants to say this is what they mean as well, or that they meant all along, then I guess we can agree. Mischief managed. I just like the term contextual emergence. You like the term mechanism. So if that's really all that's at stake, then it seems like, again, not a very interesting discussion. I also think it's worth noting that the neo-mechanist has moved in the last few years, a great, as I think I've illustrated, has moved in the last few years a great deal toward something like the sort of view that people like Tony and myself adopt. So I'm almost done. Let me just briefly mention some other possible objections. First, I already talked about this, but people will say, for many of us, this is just a discussion about the epistemology of scientific explanation. No ontic implications are at stake, implied or assumed. And you already saw my response to that. I think, first of all, these are counterexamples against even their explanatory descriptions of what's going on. And I think they're also counterexamples against any sort of ontological localization and decomposition. And I think that those things can ultimately not be separated. Because again, if the explanations are not tracking the physical aspects of these systems, then what's the point of learning about them, other than for purely pragmatic or instrumental reasons? Two, someone might say there's no normative or ontic force to neo-mechanism. It's just a heuristic that scientists follow sometimes. Again, if that's all somebody wants to assert, then fine. Who can disagree? That's just a fact about what scientists in part do. But I think it's very clear from the passages I read you in the beginning, from Craver and Glennon, and I could certainly, in the paper that the commentators have, I bring many more passages to bear. I think it's certainly clear that at least some subset of neo-mechanists want this to have normative force. Three, the neo-mechanists grant that there are exceptions to mechanistic explanation, even in biology. So there's nothing monolithic here. Well, that's good, and I certainly agree with them. And I agree that there are mechanistic explanations as well. But the question is, do we agree or disagree about the kinds of cases that we're talking about? Because if the sorts of epigenomics, network explanations. If mechanistic explanation fails there, then it fails centrally. 4, there are some other important notions, we may hear about this today. There are some other important notions of localization and decomposition that I've neglected that nonetheless always obtains a mechanistic explanation. So the idea here is we need to cook up a different notion of localization and decomposition, that I don't have the right one, and that if we have the right one, we'll see that there are no counterexamples. And so the only thing I can say, of course, is, I will consider them one by one. Finally, there's no real debate here because of explanatory or ontic pluralism of some sort. Let me be clear that I'm definitely a fan of explanatory and ontological pluralism of some varieties, but not to the extent where I think these debates are completely deflated, where the only thing we have left to do is just go into laboratories and look at what different kinds of biologists are doing at various scales and with different kinds of explanatory tools. I think that the claims that I've been making and that biologists and neuroscientists have been making about these systems being non-decomposable are well justified empirically and not merely just another explanatory perspective or point of view. Thank you.